Supporters of the Fair Share tax amendment of the state constitution are gearing up for the next stage on their way to a possible ballot question next year. If approved, the measure would raise taxes on annual income of more than $1 million with new revenue targeted for education and transportation infrastructure. Over the past few decades, referendums to increase taxes have met with considerable resistance from voters. But a new survey by MassINC Polling Group shows the tax measure or some of the key arguments in its favor has considerable support. To tell us about the findings are the polling group's president, Steve Koczela, and from one of the partners in the survey, the Mass Budget and Policy Center, senior policy analyst, Kurt Wise. Gentlemen, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Glad to be here.
I want to start with the policy around this and going to Kurt because I know this is a process that began before the pandemic when maybe things seem to be a lot different from our perspective now. But why is it so important to get this new revenue?
Well, the state, so it has been a long process. This began several years back, and at that time, it was clear from polling that voters, and large majorities of voters supported efforts to increase funding on education and transportation. People understand the need for investments in all kinds of areas throughout the state for economic development and general prosperity and equity issues as well. This new poll allows us to understand that those concerns, that support has certainly not diminished, and in fact has increased. And we can, Steve can talk to more of the specifics of that, but people see not only the ongoing need for things like education and transportation, but all the new needs for testing, for additional kinds of investments in schools, additional investments for workers, people who are out of work, support for housing. There's a long list of increased needs, and the understanding among voters that those needs are there is reflected, I think, in the results of this poll.
Turning to Steve Koczela, one thing you're I'm sure aware of is that there's always this big difference between referendum questions and the things you ask voters in a survey. Tell me about the way you designed a survey, what you really wanted to hear from voters.
Yeah, the survey was doing a bunch of things. I mean, one of the things it was doing was looking at what voters wanted to see given the situation that we're in at this point, given the economic realities that COVID has brought about. And then it also looked at not just the Fair Share Amendment, but a variety of different potential revenue sources. And I think the general finding was that there's a lot of consistency in terms of how voters are viewing the current situation, the current economic realities of the pandemic, and what they see as the responses, both what they see in terms of what they think the state legislature needs to be doing, and then who they think should be paying for these things to the extent that any of the items in the poll required new revenue. There's just this general perception that it is mostly upper income people, it's mostly larger businesses that have done pretty well recently, and it's mostly lower income people and mostly, smaller businesses and middle income, I should say, that have not done well. And there's a range of things that voters think need to be done and a lot of consistency in terms of how they think it should be paid for.
Well, I was not surprised to see that there's a lot of sympathy out there for helping certain groups of people, frontline workers and some of the other people with acute needs at this point. But the perception of how much the corporate sector is doing with the tax burden, you get a pretty strong response there about, maybe they should do more.
And that's consistent with other polling and sort of broader societal trends that we're seeing out there. Some of it, no doubt, comes from a look at what's going on nationwide and even worldwide, and surfing the national headlines and seeing headlines about how much Amazon pays, for instance, or that sort of thing. All of that kind of contributes to what this poll finds. This isn't exclusively an evaluation of exactly what's happening in Massachusetts. This is a broader look at sort of how people are feeling about taxes and spending in society writ large, where there is really a perception that upper income residents and large businesses pay too little, and vice versa for lower and middle income residents and smaller businesses.
Yeah. Coming back to Kurt Wise, a common perception, or at least a shorthand in the mind, might be that people who make more money and own more property must pay more taxes. But I guess what you have found over the years, it doesn't exactly work out that way.
Well, so on a strictly dollar basis, that's true. But the reason that's true is because we have very unequal distribution of income and wealth in in our society nationally, but even more so here in Massachusetts. So the reality is that when you look at it, taxes as a percent of income, of household income, then yes, low and middle income households are paying a much larger share of their available resources towards state and local taxes than higher income households are.
Well, one of the other things I picked up from the responses here was there also seemed to be a perception that maybe some immigrants, maybe people who might not have legal status, they're not carrying their weight either. And I guess there's a lesson there about assumptions we make about people and their tax contributions.
Interesting. I didn't really pick up on that as much, but what I saw in the results was that people were actually open to the idea of various emergency measures, regardless of immigration status. One of the ones, for instance, was that basically as long as you've paid taxes yourself, then you should be eligible for emergency benefits, essentially. And there's high support for the idea of extending emergency benefits, both just to furloughed and laid off workers in general. But then we also asked half of respondents, well, what about that same question if we add on the words regardless of the immigration status? And there we found 70% said that they thought that people should be eligible for those benefits regardless of immigration status. So that wasn't something that I necessarily picked up on. I also picked up on the same thing for emergency funding for small businesses if they're owned by women and minorities, for instance. There was kind of a lot of openness to pretty, what by, I guess, standard Massachusetts media terms would be pretty big departures from the way things have been done in the past, and some pretty aggressive interventions we saw support for in this poll.
I'll just toss in there very quickly on that issue, Chris, that it is in fact the case that both documented and undocumented workers are contributing significant amounts of taxes to our revenue base in Massachusetts through both employer-based taxes and sales taxes and property taxes. So those people are significant taxpayers.
And even if they're renters, they're helping a landlord pay taxes.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you one other thing, though, Kurt, because if this goes on the ballot, I'm sure we're going to hear from the other side. They're going to be saying things like, well, Massachusetts is going to be less competitive. They won't be able to attract businesses. Some businesses will leave the state. So are you prepared to say something in response to that?
Oh, absolutely. There's been a great deal of excellent research on business responses to taxes, but more in particular, as regards the Fair Share Amendment, the millionaire's tax, response of higher income households to taxes that specifically fall on higher income households. And that research has unequivocally shown that there is a vanishingly small number of households that respond by leaving a state in the face of these taxes. One of my favorite studies actually looks at differentials in tax rates across a city, where the city line, the city straddles two states, a state line. And in fact, people won't move across town to avoid increased taxes on higher income households. This is a non-issue, but it's certainly one that's going to be highlighted by people who oppose folks at the upper end paying a fair share of their taxes.
Steve, I want to come back to the fundamentals around the design of the survey, because there also seems to be a lesson here for how people should campaign on this ballot referendum. How would you crystallize that?
Well, one of the things, there's a couple ways to look at that. One of them is that we found over the years, actually, that this often has more to do with fairness than it does with education and transportation. In various ways that this question has been asked, or in the original construction, for instance, of the ballot question itself, the funding was dedicated specifically to education and transportation uses. We've found over the years that it is that the support for this general framework is less to do with that, less to do with how the revenue is used, and more to do with the issue of fairness. So, I wouldn't give advice to candidates necessarily on how to talk about this, but just in terms of what voters are thinking about, I'd say that it does seem to have more to do with just the general perception of who's paying too much, who's paying not enough, who's paying the right amount, than it does specifically with the perception of needs in these areas. That's not to say that voters don't see needs in these areas, because they certainly do, but I think you'd see support pretty high for this kind of framework, even if there wasn't this this sort of putting this additional element of putting the money towards specific uses.
Coming back to Kurt, I mean, one of the other selling points for this amendment is that the money would go to areas of critical need, the education, the transportation needs. But, you know, I'm also expecting that people are going to argue against that by saying this is just going to be a shell game. If you put more money here, you're going to take more money from over there. And we're almost going to be back where we started.
Well, just to be clear, the newest iteration, the Fair Share Amendment, does not specifically designate the money within the constitutional change to education and transportation. That was an adjustment made after a constitutional challenge that focused on that issue back a year ago. So the newest iteration does not require that specific targeting. That said, people recognize, I mean, I think that this polling results show that people recognize a really significant list of very real needs. Education and transportation are certainly on that list. Daycare is on that list, healthcare is on that list. There are many ways in which our state has underinvested and over the years. And it is also clear from the research that investing in these areas is the high road and the clear road to increase prosperity and strong economic growth. People, I think, have an increasing understanding of that and support these kinds of measures to make all kinds of investments that can bring prosperity and grow our state economy.
Steve, more than 40 years ago, in much more inflationary times, this state clobbered the proposal for a graduated income tax. And I think one of the big fear-mongering points was that we'd all be victimized by bracket creep and have to pay more and more taxes. But you've basically, with this new measure, that's not going to be an issue.
Well, I think Kurt's probably better to speak to the technical aspects of how it would be designed, but I would say that that there still is this perception among about half, maybe a small majority, that Massachusetts is an unusually high tax state, and there is the perception also among many that each resident's region of the state gets back less than they pay. So there is still, I'd say, hesitation about taxes. We often see, for instance, when we're conducting focus groups around the state, one of the first things that comes up is the big dig. There's still a lot of kind of storytelling, I guess, from the past that does certainly impact how Massachusetts residents are feeling now. I think that the countervailing force in this case is just the very strong perception that and awareness that wealth is so unequal, and taxes, who pays taxes, the perception that that's unequal. All these things combine together to make this particular measure gain broad support. But you can see that there's a lot of other measures which could potentially be used for these these needs that many voters perceive that those measures don't get nearly as broad support. And there we're talking about things like the gas tax and sales tax and income tax and so forth. So it's not like people are in general support of raising a whole bunch of different taxes, but there is strong support for this specific item.
Right. Well, gentlemen, thank you both very much for taking the time to go through that.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, we'd like to thank Steve Koczela from MassINC Polling Group and Kurt Wise from the Mass Budget and Policy Center. And we'll have more news in just a moment.